Morning, everyone. Morning, everyone. Morning. Good, you're here. Great. Welcome, Ridley. Congratulations, you guys. We congratulated you without you being here. Your grandparents and a few other relatives around, so great to have Ridley here with us. Beautiful, beautiful young fella. So welcome. I also want to extend sympathy to Edward Rayfuse, who lost his brother earlier this week. Edward, very much in our prayers, Edward and Linda and your family in the loss of your brother. And please uphold them in prayer. And again, I want to say thank you for being here. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to those that are watching online. We have a number of folk who are following our messages online as we work through the story. If that whole idea of the story is unfamiliar to you, just take a peek in the bulletin that you have. There's just a little write-up about what the story is. I won't explain it all today, but we are on week 6 of a series, a 31-week series called The Story, as we move from Genesis to Revelation. I'd like you to listen to a few verses that have a similar theme. Job 12, verse 12. Wisdom is with the aged, and understanding in length of days. Wisdom is with the aged. How many agree with that? Oh, come on, don't be shy. Wisdom is with the aged. Leviticus 19:32. You shall stand up before the gray head and honor the face of an old man, and you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. Proverbs 23, verse 22. Listen to your father who gave you life. I hope you're all adding mother and man to this. Father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Deuteronomy 32:7. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. 1 Kings 12:5. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who had stood before Solomon his father while he was yet alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer the people? Ephesians 6, verse 1 and 3, the last of these verses. Children, you got it. Obey your parents, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. I noticed that children doesn't have an age limit there. Children who have parents, even who parents were gone, honor them, that it may go well with you. Life is a teacher. Agreed? Life is a teacher. And those who have lived much life often have lessons to teach us. You know things now, if you're of a certain age, that you probably didn't know 5 years ago. You've learned things. You've been through some challenging things. You've been through some great things. You know some things now that you didn't know a few years ago. You may even know things that you didn't know yesterday, today. Life teaches us. As a church family across the generations, we have much to learn from each other. And we already referred to that in our interview with the story. We have much to learn from each other. But there's a particular wisdom that comes with having lived life, with its successes and its failures. Lessons have been learned, truths have surfaced that have great value and can be passed on from one generation to the other. Chapter 6 of the story focuses primarily on the desert wanderings of God's people before they cross what river? The River Jordan, on into the Promised Land. The journey from Sinai to Canaan is not a particularly long journey. The journey to the edge of the Jordan, not a particularly long journey. When traveled directly on usual routes, and there were usual routes in that day, even as a massive group, million plus, that journey would have taken months, not years. Greg, you pointed. Where are you, Greg? Oh, pointed at 40 years. Shouldn't have taken that long. GPS wouldn't have told you that's how long it would take. But the GPS had to recalculate a few times along the way. The story gives us passages from, the book called The Story, gives us passages from Numbers and Deuteronomy and ties them together chronologically to tell the story of the time in between living at the foot of Mount Sinai and entering the promised land, or being about to enter the promised land. It's a time when many lessons were learned. Most often, it seems, those lessons were learned through failure, through lack of faith. And I think those of you that have read this chapter will agree with me that this chapter is not an easy read. Agreed? This chapter is not an easy read. It is filled with expressions of complaint, of impatience, frustration toward God on the part of God's people. It shows us acts of disobedience, selfishness, idolatry, immorality. And as well, we see from God expressions of frustration and anger and judgment. Perhaps the most difficult to watch and read about is the fallout and repercussions of the sin of God's chosen people. Disobedience does not go unanswered in this part of the journey, and frankly, in any part of the journey. Disobedience does not go unanswered. There is a consequence to sin. There is punishment for sin. And that's a real part of this section of the journey, a part of the whole journey, even as we come to the one who came for us, who paid the price for the consequence of our sin. Many lessons are learned along the way. And even as Moses is facing his own death at the end of this chapter, death without entering into the promised land with his people, Moses is able to see it but not enter into it. And Moses looks back at this time and gives what the author of the story calls a farewell address. Parts of that address are recorded in the story. In Scripture, this address is much longer. In the actual Bible, it's much longer. But parts of it are taken out and put into the story. I want to read just the beginning of that farewell address. And as I read it, we shared this last night. I'm going to read just a bit of a shorter section than we read last night. But as we read it, and it's Moses' words to his people, he evidently had become better at speaking by this point, because the words are quite eloquent. But these are Moses' words to his people. After a long life, after lessons learned. And as I read it, and again, I'm going to read only part of this, as I read it, listen for the lessons that Moses is trying to teach his people. Listen for the lessons. Make mental note of them. These are the words of Moses as he spoke to all Israel in the wilderness east of the Jordan. The Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He's watched over your journey through this vast wilderness. These 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you, and you have not lacked anything. Despite the grumbling, despite the complaining, despite the hunger, despite the thirst at times, God has provided, and Moses is able to look back and say, you know what? You haven't lacked anything. This is page 84, by the way, if some of you have your book with you, the story. It's page 84. About just over halfway down that first page, page 84. Ask now about the former days, long before your time, from the day God created human beings on the earth. Ask from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything so great as this ever happened, Or has anything like it ever been heard of? Has any other people heard the voice of God speaking out of fire as you have and lived? Has any God, small g, ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another by testing, by signs, wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds, like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? You were shown these things so that you might know that the Lord is God. Beside him, there is no other. From heaven, he made you hear his voice to discipline you. On earth, he showed you his great fire. You heard his words from out of the fire, because he loved your ancestors and chose your descendants after them. He brought you out of Egypt by his presence and great strength to drive out before you nations who were greater and stronger than you, to bring you into their land, to give to you an inheritance as it is today. Acknowledge and take heart this day that the Lord God is in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. Keep his decrees and commands, which I'm giving you today, so that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may live long in the land the Lord your God gives you for all time. Just one more part of a short paragraph. The next paragraph. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on who? Your children. These commands are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. Again, the farewell address is much longer than what's here in the story, and even much longer than what's here. It's a long address addressing the governance and the politics and the structures of Israel that are to be set up after they get into the Jordan, but this is some of the more personal address. So when you listen to that, what do you hear Moses saying? What lessons does he want his people to learn? Just even in that short section. Just call it out. What are some things you're hearing in that? I don't want to read it again, but to remind you, but just what are you hearing in there? What does he want them to know and be reminded of?
God gave them everything they needed.
God gave them everything they needed. He is the great provider. Trust him. He will give you what you need.
He'll be with them on the journey.
He is with you. He has been with you, and he will be with you. He won't forsake you. What else? What's that?
Pass it on to the next generation.
Pass it on to the next generation. Yeah. But even before you pass it on to the next generation, do what? Keep the commandments. Obey my commands. Follow my teaching. I've shown you how to live. And lead by example. Absolutely. What else? Anything? What's that? He forgives. Absolutely.
He is just.
He is just. Yeah. Where do you hear that, Jason, in here? Or are you just thinking about that whole...
I'm thinking about the whole,
Yeah.
because I think part of it is that's part of the struggle
Yeah.
for us. It's like to understand that they have all of this knowledge, they have all these sights, signs, and wonders,
Yeah.
miraculous, and at the end of the day, they turn on him, they're back on him,
Right.
and to be just in that response.
Yeah. There is a justice here, isn't there? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. That's good. What I want to do for the rest of our message time is to focus on three things. As I read this particular address, focus on three lessons under one heading. And here's the main heading. And again, it might not seem particularly obvious that this is the heading, but it's the sense I got as I read through this and the rest of the address here in the story. The main heading I want to suggest is that Moses wants his people to look back and understand the power of God. He wants them to look back and understand the power of God so that they can move forward well. And I'm going to divide that up into three little sections. Surprises you, doesn't it? Three sections. A, His power declares that he alone is God. His power declares that he alone is God. And secondly, or B, his power demonstrates his love for his people. His power demonstrates his steadfast love for his people. And finally, his power demands our trust. His power demands our trust or obedience. I wanted to say, because it sounded softer and it sounded a little more Baptist, I wanted to say he invites our trust. Because in a sense he does give us a choice whether or not to trust him, and so he invites our trust. But his truth, his power, the authority that is in his truth, demands our obedience. It truly does demand our obedience. And when obedience doesn't follow his decrees, doesn't follow his commands, there are repercussions for our sin. Agreed on that? And so, his power demands our trust. Not because he's a tyrant who orders us to do this or do that just because he said so, but because he made us, and he made me, and he made you, and he knows what is going to bring real life to your heart, life to your spirit, life not only now, but life eternal. And so he gives us his commands and says, you know what, follow me. Be obedient. Follow in my way. Trust me. To put those 3 points just another way, if some of you are keeping notes, Moses wants his people to understand the power of the Lord's godhood or his divinity, the power of his divinity. He wants them to know the power of his love, and he wants them to know the power of his word, his decrees. First, the power of his divinity. Moses wants the people of God to understand that the one who is leading them is God. And you heard it a few times even in that section. He is God, the Lord is God, and there is no other. This is God. This is God you are following. The only wise, almighty, full authority, creator of all, perfect love, perfect power, perfect justice. This is God that is leading you. God who is leading you. Recognize his power. Recognize that he is God and worship him. Worship him in your gathering. Worship him in your life. Bow before him as your people. Moses knew that the people sometimes forget that. The people sometimes worship other gods. They're in a culture that did that. We're in a culture that does that. We just call our gods different things. But they're tempted to worship other gods or to create idols to worship. Moses wants his people to understand that the one who has been leading them is God. And folks, the one who we worship today is God. And there is no other. We're not here playing church. Martin, open up this morning. You know, we may have likes or dislikes in music volume or too quiet, too loud. Used to be pews or chairs. I think we're kind of used to the chairs now. We talk about all sorts of things, and it's okay. That's all right. We need to work those things out. But we need to ultimately remember that why we are here, why we sing, why we read Scripture, why we pray, is because of God Almighty, the one true God. He is leading you. He has redeemed you. He loves you. And he wants you to worship him fully and completely with your heart and with your life, to honor him. And Moses knew that his people needed to understand that and look back and say, you know what? All sorts of ups and downs, all sorts of complaints and grumbling, but you know what? That's God in that fire. That's God in that cloud. That's God in that burning bush. That's God who wants to lead you across this Jordan and will lead you. So acknowledge him. It is the one true God that we worship and worship no other. We can stop there this morning. That would be enough. It is the one true God that we worship. Agreed? Agreed. That sounds obvious, doesn't it? We're worshiping God. Yeah. But you know what? That's big. That's big. Listen to Moses' farewell. Has any God, small g, ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation by testing, by signs, wonders, war, mighty hand outstretched, by great and awesome deeds, like all the things your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? You were shown these things so that you might know that the Lord is God. Beside him there is no other. 2. Moses wanted his people to see that God's power demonstrated his love for them. God's power demonstrated his love for them. He is powerful, yes, but he loves you. And he's committed in covenant love to you, to God's people, the chosen people, and I would suggest to you this morning through the new covenant of Jesus Christ and his blood. Moses wanted his people to see that God's power demonstrated his love for them. Listen to his words. The Lord your God has blessed you in all the works of your hands. He's watched over your journey through this vast wilderness. These 40 years the Lord your God has been with you. You have not lacked anything. And then just a little later, on earth he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words from out of the fire. Because he loved your ancestors and chose your ancestors after them, he brought you out of Egypt by his presence and his great strength to drive out before you the nations greater and stronger than you and bring you into the land to give you an inheritance as it is today. And then finally later, in your heart, know that as a man disciplines his sons, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Fathers, mothers, is discipline love? Part of it, isn't it? Part I hate it. Just had this flashback of Jana. Oh, sorry, she's not here. Don't tell Jana this is of Jana when you discipline Jana. You didn't need to say a word. This is all you needed to do. And she was done. So. Matthew, on the other hand, won't tell you what we did to him, because I think it's illegal these days. But he would look at me and go, didn't hurt that. Didn't hurt. Until one day he kicked the wall so hard he put his foot right through it. And he felt bad and came in crying. So we left that hole in the wall for a long time, just for a long time. Anyway, off track. Moses is reminding his people that God loves them. We have this on tape, don't we? Don't ever let my kids watch this. Moses is reminding them that God loves them. That he made a covenant of love, a promise to love them. That he has been with them. He's been angry, yes. He's been disappointed in them, yes. He felt like getting rid of the whole bunch of them, absolutely, yes. But in the end, being faithful to his loving promise that protected them, gave them power, gave them instruction, gave them discipline, like a good father or mother's discipline. God's love is constant. And though it does not exclude righteous anger and even judgment, it is constant and unshakable for God's chosen people and for you as his sons and daughters. For you who haven't yet come into that relationship, that's the relationship he wants for you. A relationship of love, constant, perfect love. Love now and love forever. Moses had seen it and had every reason to believe that the covenant love declared long before to Abraham, the love revealed in God's presence with them, would continue with them after they crossed the Jordan and then on forever. God is not going to forget his loving covenant to you as people. And he wanted them to know that. That was a lesson. He wanted them to understand. You are loved and will be loved eternally. The story of God reveals that God's love would accomplish its purposes and bring out of Israel a blessing for all the nations, for the whole world. Because God so loved the world, he would move in love. That chapter's coming. God's power declares his love, a love that is as true today as it was then. Know that he loves you. Know that he loves you. Finally, God's power demands or necessitates our obedience. Because God is God, his instructions carry full authority and necessitate our obedience, call for our obedience. Again, that doesn't mean we're not given choice, we are, but God's instruction demands obedience, and failure to obey always has consequences. There is a price to be paid for disobedience. We see the reality of that price in the lives of the wandering nation of Israel and in the lives of its leaders, even Moses. We see the price and the consequences of sin in our own lives, don't we? When we sin, when we get off track, when we are disobedient and we know it, we see the results in our own hearts. We see the results in our own spirit. We see the results even in our own bodies. Sometimes it's very obvious. For example, the one who abuses his body through excess, through alcohol, through drugs, reaps the rewards of that. There are consequences in our bodies, in our spirit, in our hearts. Sometimes the consequences are less obvious, like when our sins affect those around us, even our children. And we see that in the disobedience of God's people, refusing to go into the promised land at first. Their lack of faith affected their lives, didn't it? When they refused to go, they were destined to what? To die in the wilderness. But their children were destined to wander for 40 years. Their lack of faith affected their lives. The elders would, again, ultimately die in the desert, but the children would wander before they had another chance to enter the promised land. Ultimately, as God's purposes unfold, the price and consequences of sin is seen in Jesus, again, who himself bore the penalty for our sin in his own body. And we're thankful for that by God's grace today. It's why we're here. There is power and authority in God's word and instruction, and to turn from it has consequences. We see that all throughout this chapter, and that's one of the reasons it's hard to read. The sin is answered by sometimes extreme punishment. Lack of faith to enter the promised land, one of the sins. Grumbling over lack of food, over living conditions, over shortages of water. Miriam and Aaron sinned by complaining to God that Moses got all the glory, all the authority. Hasn't God spoken through us too, they said, and God brought them up to account for that one. Did people express anger and impatience with God? None of us are ever impatient, right? We're not impatient. None of you are realizing that it's 12 o'clock now and we should be almost done. None of us. No. And we are almost done. I heard one pastor, saw online one pastor giving a little bit of a test to his congregation to test their patience level. And he asked them a whole pile of questions. I'm only going to test you with 4 of them. To test your impatience tolerance or your patience level. First question. Have you ever cut through or been tempted to cut through a gas station to avoid stopping at a red light? Yep. This one right up here especially. I live there, gas station's there, red lights are set. Almost home. Second, people, is this true of you? People who talk slowly. question. I'm annoyed when the person in front of me, instead of using their Cash App card, pulls out a checkbook to write a check. No? You guys are much better than I am. When I see a checkbook come out. 4, I often find myself finishing people's sentences. Any of you? I often find myself finishing people's sentences. Can't wait for them to get it out. Well, that's a pretty harmless list of impatient qualities, but we see in chapter 6 a real impatience, a real lack of faith, giving up on God, failing to trust in his promises that his word would be true or unfold. We can be impatient. We can also become blind to his blessings and complain about not getting what we want when we want it. Folks, we need to count our blessings. We need to count our blessings. One speaker I heard talked about the people of Israel. He said, we can be like the people of Israel crossing the Red Sea, and we've got walls of water standing up on either side of us, God protecting our families from sure death at the hands of Pharaoh's armies. And we can have God's incredible protection, walls of water stacked up, and we choose to complain about the mud between our toes. Sometimes we lose sight of God's blessing, and we can get carried away with the mud between our toes. Again, our disobedience can look like impatience, blindness to blessings. Sometimes it's just a refusal to obey. Israel, I'm asking you to do this, to go into the land, because I'm going to take you there. I'm going to defeat the people. And Israel says, no, not going to do it. You should see the people. They look huge. We feel like grasshoppers. We look like grasshoppers, and we look the same to them. We're teeny in our own eyes. What was the problem there? Who were they looking to? They were looking with their own eyes, and they were looking at what the other people thought. They weren't looking at what God thought. Walk by faith, not by sight. Moses speaks to the rock, or was asked to speak to the rock. I'll pour out water from it. No, Lord, that's not how I'm going to do it. He took his staff and he hit the rock. Seems like a small thing for the consequence given. And if you're like me, you kind of stop there and you go, wow, that's a big consequence for hitting a rock instead of speaking to it. But we have to maybe trust God to know that what was going on in Moses' heart, maybe a little deeper than just that action. All sorts of theories, and I'm not going to take time to give you some theories about what was really happening there. Issues of pride, issues of anger, not representing a holy God to the people, but quite simply a refusal to obey. And there were consequences for Moses. I'm going to end in the material. Maybe get our worship team to come up, and I think we're going to finish with a couple of songs. We'll be led in prayer just before that happens. But in the group material that many of you are using, it likens the journey of Moses and his people to a trip in the car. A trip to a wonderful destination, whatever that wonderful destination might be for you. A trip that is characterized by those kids in the back who are complaining, who are grumbling. A trip that takes longer than it should because of driver error. But one of the things stressed is the realization, and those of you that are in groups will look at this, one of the things that's stressed is the fact that the driver error doesn't just affect the driver. It affects the children. And it's important for us to think about that. Both sides of that. We're given an incredible opportunity in the church as we have an influence on these kids. Next Sunday, we're going to have this whole front of the church filled with young children and infants that we're going to commit to loving and supporting them and their families. And we have a responsibility as a church family to follow God's way, to follow God's path. And that's a responsibility. And the decisions we make for good and for bad and for evil will affect our kids. And God's a God of grace. Thank goodness God's a God of grace. because I didn't do it all right with my kids, and I suspect none of you are in that perfect parent boat. God's grace is good, a good thing. But it's important for us to recognize that our decisions, our obedience, makes a difference in the lives of our kids. Watched quite a number of videos this week from people who are dealing with issues that their great-grandfathers dealt with, and their grandfather, and their father, and now they as children are dealing with. The sins of the father really do, of the mother and father, sometimes do visit on the next generation. But also, the obedience and the faith and the blessings and the grace and the honesty and the love of the father and mother also visit on the children. And that's who I want to be. That's who I know we can be as a church family as we commit next week and in the years ahead to driving well for the next generation. We're going to be led in prayer now. Who's leading us in prayer?
I am.
Wonderful. Goldie, come on up and lead us in prayer, and then we'll, after you pray for us,